Frattini. Hello. My name is Daria Labanova. I'm Deputy Director at the Gorchakov Foundation. Last year, we launched a series of joint discussions with the Center for Eurasian Studies. Today, we'll talk about Afghanistan after the withdrawal of US troops. Who can help build a strong state in Afghanistan? Thank you all for joining us today. We'll have a Q&A time after our speakers give their presentations. Please keep your mics muted when our experts speak, and if possible, keep your cameras on. I give the floor now to the Executive Director of the Gorchakov Foundation, Leonid Gorchakov. Thank you very much, Daria. I'm happy to welcome all of our participants today. I'd like to say that the subject of this video conference is what I guess not just half of the world is concerned about today. The whole world is concerned about this. Afghanistan is the point where a lot of answers come together, and we have a person who knows better than anybody in the world, I guess. I'm not afraid of making this statement. Mr. Kabulov, he has been overseeing these matters for many years, and he is the leading expert. Thank you for joining us today. I'm happy to give the floor to a friend of the Gorchakov Foundation. We also have Mr. Frattini with us, the Foreign Minister of Italy, European Commissioner for International Affairs. Also, Mr. Frattini played a major role in addressing the Afghanistan. Hello, Franco.
Hi.
And I hope we have a good discussion.
Great to see you.
Great to see you again. Well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gorchakov, for your opening remarks. I will also ask Andrea Giannotti to say a few words by way of opening. Thank you, Daria. Can you hear me well? I will be very brief. I can agree with everything that Mr. Gorchakov said. I totally agree. This is another event in the series of events organized jointly by the Gorchakov Foundation and the Center for Eurasian Studies. And the subject we are going to discuss today is extremely important and extremely urgent. Unfortunately, it has political, economic, and strategic ramifications. And we have some real powerhouses present with us today. Ambassador Kabulov and Minister Frattini. The fact that they're here today underscores how important this matter is. After the pandemic, after all the difficulties that we've been through lately, I think this is an excellent new beginning of very fruitful cooperation. So, big thank you to all the participants, especially to our speakers. Let's get started. Mr. Kabulov.
Замир Набиевич, пожалуйста, вам слово.
First of all, I'm grateful to the Gorchakov Foundation. I'm grateful to Mr. Gorchakov for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here today. It's great that you have decided to have this discussion on a very important issue. It's no longer just a regional issue. It now has a global dimension as well. So, at the very beginning, you asked a very ambitious question, how we can turn Afghanistan into a strong state. This may be too ambitious. Currently, we need to consider how we can help the people of Afghanistan to rebuild a working, normal state. The international community has to play an important role here. And this is something that we need to discuss today. In detail, let's see if we can come up with solutions to address this problem. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kabulov. We can move on now directly to your presentation. So I would ask you to speak first, and then after you speak, and then Mr. Frattini speaks later, we'll have a Q&A session. Okay, I will try to be brief. Many people write about Afghanistan today. Some are right, some are wrong, but everybody is concerned about the events currently unfolding in this long-suffering country. We, as experts in Russia, have a very practical reason to be concerned about this situation. We have been warning about this kind of turn of events for years, so we were not wrong. The current situation we have in Afghanistan is a result of the strategic mistakes that the US and its allies made with their Afghanistan policy. We predicted many of the things that are happening today. So very briefly, one of the biggest mistakes that the US made in Afghanistan was, instead of helping rebuild a proper, neutral state, the United States took advantage of this situation to create a network of military bases in Afghanistan. And this affected the entire region, neighboring countries as well, including the Russian Federation, not to mention immediate neighbors of Afghanistan. The temptation proved to be strong to the US, and they made this mistake. The second strategic mistake that the US made, instead of just helping Afghanistan with its development, developing its institutions, its economy, based on time-tested Afghan traditions, the US engaged in democratization, imposing their own views on democracy. And as a result, they suffered a failure. So we are now dealing with this problem as well. These are the mistakes that the Americans made. Now, the primary goal for all the countries interested in normalizing the situation in Afghanistan is to prevent Afghanistan from turning a breeding ground for international terrorists. A lot of mistakes have been made, so it's a difficult discussion. I will not get into too many details. It would be easier for me to answer specific questions later on. I don't want to take too much of your time right now. But I can tell you that currently we are facing a situation where you have a weak, inefficient central government in Afghanistan trying to survive. A lot of administrative and political mistakes have been made in recent years, but I have to say that those mistakes were made based on recommendations, primarily from the US and some other NATO countries. But it is the people of Afghanistan who will suffer as a result of all those mistakes. So, what we need to do today is address the most urgent matters. A strong state in Afghanistan is a remote prospect. Today, we need to do our best to help both parties in Afghanistan. When I talk about both parties, I mean Kabul, the government of Afghanistan, and a broad range of ethno-political leaders, and the Taliban. The Taliban is a political military movement. These are Afghan people who have different views regarding the present and the future of their country. These are people in war, people who fight for their convictions, and they fight better than anybody else, any other party in Afghanistan, today or yesterday. So, whether we like it or not, this is something that we need to consider, and we have to be practical about this. The Russian government is led primarily by the interests of the Afghan people. The Afghan people are tired of this war. They want peace. But what kind of peace do we want to see? Peace at any cost or not? So we believe that the perfect solution would be to launch substantive talks, which will result in creating a coalition government in Afghanistan. And there's a group of most influential countries involved in this: Russia, the United States, China, Pakistan. This club is open for other members as well, other influential players. But why these countries specifically? Together with our partners, we call this the Big Three, the expanded version of the Big Three. We understand that our countries have a lot of influence with both parties in Afghanistan, and we'll try to use this influence to convince and motivate both parties to come to the negotiating table and start talking to each other. And this will be a long process. You know how they say in Afghanistan, inshallah. Hopefully, this process, even after it gets started, it doesn't mean that we will see peace the next day in Afghanistan. It will be a long road to peace. We believe that this kind of coalition transitional government has to have a certain time limit, maybe 2 years or 3 years. I don't want to decide this for the people of Afghanistan, but it has to be a temporary body that will not be elected, re-elected after a certain period. No, the purpose of this transitional government would be to create conditions for Afghanistan to rebuild as a normal state with democratic institutions. And when I talk about democratic institutions, I have to make it clear that I'm talking about Afghan standards of democracy, not foreign standards imposed on Afghanistan. It will be a long process. It will be a long road. But we need to start somewhere. We need to start making first steps. I think I will stop here, and I will allow other participants in this discussion to say something. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо, Замир Набиевич.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kabulov, for your remarks. I think we can get into some details later on during the Q&A session, but right now I would like to turn to former Foreign Minister of Italy and President of the Institute for Eurasian Studies, Mr. Frattini. Mr. Frattini, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. First of all, let me thank warmly my old friend Leonid Droshevsky. Many thanks, Leonid, for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to see you, at least virtually, after a so long time while waiting for meeting you in person in Moscow as soon as possible. I'm very happy to see Ambassador Kabulov, the special envoy of the president of the Russian Federation for Afghanistan, not only former ambassador, a man who has a real huge experience about Afghanistan and the geostrategic situation on that. Thanks to my friend, Professor Andrea Giannotti, with whom we have a long-standing tradition of cooperation in Russia at university, at the academies, and so on and so forth. I've been listening to Ambassador Kabulov with great attention. And having been myself heavily involved since the very beginning of the Western story in Afghanistan in 2001, I was not yet foreign minister. I was the minister coordinating Italian secret services. So I had the opportunity to supervise the situation under this different angle. And now in 2021, I can say many mistakes have been made by the West in general. By our American allies, we have been loyal within NATO, within the transatlantic cooperation with the United States, but as it happens between friends, one has to recognize the mistakes made. Apart what Ambassador Kabulov just said, I want to say three things. First of all, there was a real attempt to train Afghan forces. In this, I have to recognize with some pride the role being played by Italian Carabinieri. Nobody can deny that when the training forces led by Italy were on the ground training Afghan forces completely unprepared at the very beginning of the mission, we got some concrete results in improving their capacity to prevent and to fight against terrorist attack. And I would stress, with no cases of collateral victims. Never Italians killed innocent civilians. I'm very proud of that. And this is one of the positive elements in a situation that Ambassador Kabulov described correctly, in my view. There has been, for sure, a very little, if no capacity from the United States to understand immediately. I give you an example. We Italians were located in the province of Herat, which now is under siege because, of course, Taliban is trying to regain ground in that area. There, Italians, instead of destroying everything, trying to help Afghans to recuperate cultivation of saffron instead of cultivation of drugs. Production of marble was an old tradition in Afghanistan. And if you know, and I'm sure Ambassador Kabulov knows very well, I myself, being a judge myself, I promoted the establishment of a prosecutor office in the province of Herat, led by a woman prosecutor, dealing with crimes of violence against women. Unprecedented initiative undertaken in a province, the province of Herat, who was, I would say, unlike other regions of Afghanistan, rather helped to rebuild the legal economy and normal economy, as you, Ambassador Kabulov, very rightly suggested. Unfortunately, that didn't happen everywhere in Afghanistan. In many cases, there was killing and destroying rather than helping the young Afghans, for example, to get out from the terrible crisis and from the, I would say, extremist of some groups and faction of Taliban. The second mistake, in my personal view, has been the fact of having announced it in very emphatic way. I remember lastly President Trump, negotiation with Taliban are okay. We are close to finish negotiations. Talibans are in agreement to get a deal. Absolutely not true. Why? Because we have to recognize we in the West have a very little capacity to understand, I would say, the variety of the social, ethnic, religious, and geostrategic components of Afghanistan. This little capacity has led many to make a mistake to export democracy. This is, for me, being a judge, extremely important point. You're absolutely right, Ambassador Kabulov. We cannot pretend to root our constitution, our constitutional principles, our standards into the framework, into the context of the Taliban-led or Afghan-led society. But there is a caveat of this. Among all the points you mentioned, and I agree, we have to create a better condition to have maybe, you talked about a grand coalition, temporary government. I would pave the way with the protagonist you mentioned, including the Russian Federation. I would talk first about a compact for Afghanistan to pave the way to create the proper condition to have one day, the sooner the better, a government which corresponds to the variety of the components of the Afghan society. But in that framework, frankly speaking, there is only one red line for me: human dignity. I would be naive. I would be a Westerner. I would be just Italian, but I cannot tolerate the women destroyed in their dignity, the young daughters obliged not to go to school. We have to do everything, but there are some minimum standards that, in my view, are not negotiable, because we have to do with the basic fundamental rights. And as you know very well, there are some group of Talibans that don't recognize at all even the basic rights of the women or other vulnerable components of the society. And this is an element where we should work together. Also because the other point you alluded to when you talked about having all around the table, including Talibans, I agree. But we have to do what the West was incapable to do, to make a distinction between those Talibans that are ready to engage and those Talibans that are not, that prefer to kill, that prefer to continue to commit terrorist actions. And it is undeniable there are some Taliban components that cannot be led back to a table. In this, I would say two final things. What is the role of the neighbors? I commend the role of Russian Federation, not only because it is well known. I appreciate very much your country in many aspects, but because I was myself present where even during a military action that Russia never agreed with, Russian Federation at a certain moment understood how important had been at that moment to improve and increase security instruments. I allude to the green light given by the Russian Federation to the transit of the West military and peacekeeping assets throughout the Russian territory to go to Afghanistan. It was another time. It was the golden time where President Putin and President Bush shaking hands in Pratica di Mare and said, Western Russia have to cooperate. But it is not another era. It was just 2002, only 19 years ago. After that, I've seen Russia, although not directly involved, well understanding need for security. And if I'm not right, now well aware of the risks at the bordering of Afghanistan. Russia is helping the neighbors, in particular Tajikistan, which is a weak state, to face and to prevent risks of infiltration in case the instability of Afghanistan propagates. And the second element concerning the neighbors is on Pakistan and China. You said, Ambassador Kabulov, rightly, that Pakistan and China are two key players to be engaged. Frankly speaking, before that, we should put much more pressure on Pakistan in order to avoid to play an ambiguous role in certain areas at the borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan. You know much better than me, than the tribes of Talibans, the ones that are the toughest, those that never will give up the terrorist action, unfortunately, still now take refuge with the blind tolerance of Pakistan supported by China. So yes to China and Pakistan, but, and in that Russia can have a role much better and much stronger than the Western role and the American role to have a political leverage on China and Pakistan in order to avoid what is always a risky situation if you want really to engage Talibans, not in the reconciliation because it's premature, as you said, but is a normal dialogue, paving the way for a future which, and this is my conclusion, is remote. You are right, it's remote, but not because it is remote is a good reason to give up, because what happens in Afghanistan doesn't stop in Afghanistan. It propagates in all the rest of the Asia and beyond. Thank you very much.
Спасибо огромное нашим докладчикам.
Thank you to our speakers. Speakers provided some very insightful remarks, and I have a few questions and one very brief comment. I'm a historian of international relations myself, and I completely agree with Mr. Frattini when he says that Mr. Kabulov has a huge experience. He now heads the second Asian department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is a special envoy, but he used to be an ambassador to Afghanistan, I believe, back in the 1980s in the Soviet embassy. And as for the situation of Afghan women, civil society, I'm sure many dislike this topic these days, but perhaps the best time for Afghan women and Afghan civil society was the 1980s. So I have a question for Mr. Kabulov on Iran's stance. As you know, relations between the Iranian government and the Taliban are terse and tense. Back in the 1990s, I think the Iranian army was placed on the border to prevent possible aggression from the Taliban. So this is my question for Mr. Kabulov. And I have a question for President Frattini as well about a possible Afghan card in the Chinese-US relationship. Can these new tensions become a new playing card for them? Can they become a pretext for elevating tensions, or perhaps for a new form of cooperation? Thank you.
У нас, по-моему, возникли технические сложности. Меня слышно?
We had some technical difficulties, but can you hear me now? Yes, everything's fine. Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Before answering your questions, allow me to quickly say a couple of words about Mr. Frattini's remarks. I believe there are very important points that he made. I would like to confirm, first and foremost, Mr. Frattini's words about the role of the Italian military in Afghanistan. I was there. I was watching very closely what different NATO contingents were doing, and I have to say that the Italians were very tactful. As we say, they didn't make matters worse. And I think they left a good legacy behind, and they are well remembered. This wasn't an adventure, unlike for Russia. So this is good. Unfortunately, not all of NATO's contingents acted that way, and this, of course, is reprehensible because the results are in evidence right now. You, Mr. Frattini, you talked about those golden days when Russia and the United States worked hand in hand on Afghanistan. I remember that romantic period very well, but it's gone now. It's history, and that's not Russia's fault. The next question leads me to a couple of other points. You were completely right when you said that there are those inside the Taliban who are radicalized and who are intractable. We understand that very well. We are very pragmatic in our approach to this movement. And this is a living movement. It's a living thing, like any organization of this kind. We estimate that about 2/3 of this movement, including its top leadership, is in favor of a political resolution to the Afghan crisis. For a number of reasons, one being tired from this decades-long war, and just plain common sense. War without an end it doesn't bode well for them personally, among other things. So, to be blunt, there are no statistics, but I would say only about 1/3 of the Taliban, including some field commanders, are radical. And there are reasons for that as well. Number one, first, mostly they're young people, as we say, the third generation of Taliban fighters. Mostly, they either grew up in training in camps, for refugee camps, or in some remote areas, and they have no sentimental feelings for their home country. They have been indoctrinated with ideas of a global jihad, the proponent of which was Osama bin Laden, or ISIS, or Daesh as it's known in Afghanistan. So this problem is there, and it's quite a classical kind of predicament where a movement is not homogeneous, and we will need to do something about it, of course. But we believe that 2/3 of the Taliban can agree on with the other force in Afghanistan, who are also ready for negotiations, and they'll find Afghan solutions to their problems. Sometimes they probably will find a peaceful settlement. Sometimes one party would need to be coerced, but there are no other ways of going about this. As far as the future of Afghan women and girls, Mr. Frattini, we in Russia share your concerns, of course, but we keep in mind that we're talking not about Russia or Italy. They have their own rooted traditions. I agree with you that perhaps the 1980s were the best times for Afghan girls and women. I think actually even earlier, the 1970s were the heyday, and that was a major contribution of the Soviet Union, which invested a lot in general education and raising the standards of general education and making it more inclusive. We built the Polytechnical University. 16,000 Afghans had a chance to be educated in the Soviet Union. So the emancipation of Afghan women started with the help of the USSR. So we are vested in this as well. But I'm an expert, and my knowledge of history and the Afghan society and state leads me to some simple conclusions. We may have a certain idea about the world. We think in European terms, in European paradigms. So from this point of view, the Taliban look like monsters who hate girls and who hate women and who would like to keep them in some kind of captivity. But let me assure you, it's not exactly true. just visit some villages, and that doesn't have to be very remote villages, villages that would be a few minutes drive from Kabul, where you have no talibs, or where they have never seen talibs. They have exactly the same restrictions, on what women and girls can do. And these restrictions still exist today, and they reflect their views on how society should function and what role women can play in this society. We have to be mindful of that if we are to understand Afghanistan better. And if we are really trying to help Afghanistan, as opposed to imposing our view on how they should live their lives. But I agree, and that with you, and that's what we do. At least, speaking for Russia, I can firmly assure you that when we talk to the Taliban, we call them on these things. We don't mince words, and we will continue doing this, trying to do this together. When I was talking about a grand coalition, I was talking about the Troika Plus format, including 4 states. This format has limited mandate. Our job is to start the process of national reconciliation as soon as possible, the process of negotiations that could lead to the end of the civil war. Then, an even more challenging, and if you will, an even costlier stage will come, and in rebuilding Afghanistan. So we have this agreement that as soon as we're done with task 1, we'll expand the range of participants and enablers, including key donors. And Italy is obviously a very important donor for Afghanistan. I'm sure that Afghans will always be grateful when they remember your input in improving life in Afghanistan.
Иран, безусловно, один из ключевых игроков.
Now, coming back to what you said about Iran, Iran is definitely one of the key players. I think that Iran and Pakistan are the 2 most important players here for Afghan settlement. When we built this Big 3 format, it was our intention from the start that Iran should also be included. But given the current situation, and I'm not even talking about US-Iranian tensions, it would be very difficult to have constructive talks with Americans and Iranians sitting at the same table together. But we definitely think that Iran is an important partner in this process. Pakistan, China, we should all work together to get the process of political settlement going. Now, on China, what you said about China, I didn't really understand what you meant by your question. You started talking about China and Pakistan card. This is different from the way we see things. We treat those countries as a reliable partner in dealing with the Afghan problem. We have discussions regarding, we have a pretty common, very close approaches to dealing with this problem. These discussions that we have with our partners in Pakistan are not always public. We discuss certain things confidentially, and we believe we are on the same side. We have a strong foundation for working together. Pakistan has legitimate security interests in Afghanistan.
опытом, негативным опытом исторического прошлого, ну, ничего не поделаешь. Это да.
Yes, we do have some legacy, some negative experiences of the past, but there is nothing we can do about it. We have to live with it. You have to work with all sorts of partners, China, America, Pakistan. We will work with all those countries in a business-like atmosphere. And this will only benefit Afghanistan and eventually all of our countries. This will remove security problems that our countries face because of the situation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ambassador Kabulov. President Frattini, would you like to respond?
Microfono.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Ambassador Kabulov for having recognized the role of the Italian training forces in Afghanistan. And I think what he said while answering to your question, Andrea, is something I can share completely. First of all, because I understand perfectly that no doubt Russia has a stronger and a better leverage to engage with countries like China and Pakistan, not to say about Iran, that no doubts are the key players to try to stabilize Afghanistan. Of course, the role of the Western countries is important as role of donors, and Italy will play its part at the proper moment. There is a serious problem now between United States, even after the change of the president, between United States and Iran. But this is a question from Andrea between United States and China, because I'm sure there would be also in the near future, also while touching upon issues like how to stabilize Afghanistan, where the mutual mistrust between China and US will remain in place. Will this prevent from a full engagement? I think yes. And since it's absolutely necessary to have both America and China committed to stabilize the future of Afghanistan, here, as I used to say in many conferences, is another topic where the role of Russia is so important. Because for the reasons I've already said, Russia has normal relations with China, Pakistan, even Iran. But despite the difficulties, despite a number of problems, Europe and many European countries, including Italy, first of all Italy, I would say, understand that without engaging Russian Federation in full cooperation for the good of solution of issues that are world global issues. We are talking about Afghanistan. We talk in other conferences about Middle East, about Libya. Everywhere, the role of Russia is absolutely necessary as an equal partner for Europe, for the West in general. This could be a way to try to overcome the mistrust which is a mutual mistrust, US-China. You know better than me. You read the American newspapers. In America, there is a deep conviction that China is trying to deepen the sphere of influence in Afghanistan only to, I would say, lead to the exploitation of raw materials, because Afghanistan is hugely rich of raw materials. And so when you consider a problem of geostrategic security, like an ambition of China to get raw materials in Afghanistan as the reason leading to deep their attention, it is absolutely clear that it's difficult to have an equal dialogue and to have a group of countries cooperating on the basis of equal dignity. This is why the role of Russia is so important now, because apart all what is dividing Russia from Europe and the West, much more is what unites Russia and the West and Europe and Italy in particular. And particularly on Afghanistan, we will never like to see once again Herat taken by the radical Talibans or Kabul under the daily bombing that we remember years and years ago. So my conclusion is that the only way is to try to get a compact of willing states equally responsible for getting out Afghanistan from the crisis. And the final word, since you said very correctly that the Afghan standards are not our standards. And of course, your rules of respecting the woman are not the rules practiced in the villages of Afghanistan. But we have to understand that the role of education in this framework of helping the civil society of Afghanistan should get a priority role without imposing democracy, without imposing our models. But since you rightly mentioned the younger generations that have been indoctrinated by the most radical factions of Taliban, we have to invest in education. And also with that, even Iranians will understand that it is in their interest to stabilize Afghanistan. You know better than me that the first country of transit and destination of the illicit international drug trafficking is Iran. And when the Italians were in Iraq, the Italians finance police has been cooperating closely with the border police of Iran by trying to block and to intercept illicit drugs going through the border. So we have a common interest that unite all of us.
Если можно, я сразу отреагирую на эти важные замечания господина.
If I may, I would like to respond straight away, because what you said, Mr. Frattini, is extremely important. I totally agree with you on many of the points you mentioned. I think we should be realistic. We are not just political commentators. We can talk, of course, about ideal situations, but this remains pretty theoretic. We need to be realists. Now, I would like to comment briefly on the US-China relations. If you start reading American newspapers, you will see a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric, but actually there is a lot of anti-Russia rhetoric as well in the US media. The current relationship between Russia and the US is not much better than the relationship that China has with the US. And still, we are ready to work with the US, not in order to help the Americans, but just to overcome the results of all the mistakes that have been made over the past 20 years. And the same goes for US-China relations. Yes, they have their differences. Yes, they have disagreements over Afghanistan. And everybody is concerned about this situation. Russia, the United States, Europe. You know what some of our colleagues say. Since we absolutely have to come together and agree, because this affects all of us. Thank you very much, Mr. Kabulov, Mr. Frattini. We have received a number of questions.
Я готов, только немножко звук, пожалуйста, подкорректируйте.
Can you stay a little longer with us, because we have a lot of questions. Yes, but you have a problem with your sound. I cannot hear you clearly. Okay, let's get started with question one. Hi. That was very interesting. I have a question for Mr. Kabulov. Mr. Kabulov, you said we have to be realists. We have to be pragmatic in dealing with Afghan problems. I have an idea. I have a question for you. It may sound cynical, but don't you think it would be very pragmatic to isolate ourselves from Afghanistan, to build a strong border, an iron wall separating ourselves from Afghanistan, and let the Afghan people deal with their own problems? Just keeping ourselves secure from drug trafficking, from terrorism, because we know how many resources have been wasted on Afghanistan. How about we just isolate ourselves from Afghanistan and let them deal with their own problems? Thank you. I understand where you're coming from. It may sound reasonable to some, but, you know, I have studied geography as well as history. So I can tell you it would be totally impossible to build an iron wall on the border of Afghanistan. There will always be holes in your iron wall. And the situation, problems will continue. So unfortunately, this kind of approach will never work. You know, frankly, I've spent a lot of Afghanistan, and I would not want them to end up in a situation like that, being isolated from the rest of the world. I am very sympathetic toward them. And from the moral point of view, I think it would be wrong to do as you suggest. And it will never work, like I said, anyway. If you gather all the armies of the world, this will still not be enough to guard the border with Afghanistan properly. And besides, other countries in Asia, they have their own concept of security matters. They will never agree to your proposal. So that's my answer. Thank you. Just one I have a clarification. Can we quote this in the media? I think it's an open discussion. I don't have any objection. I sorry. Mr. Frattini will have to leave shortly. We have a question for you, Mr. Frattini, before you go.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Labanova, for giving me the floor. And thank you, both speakers, for your elucidating remarks. And my questions, first of all, addressed to Mr. Frattini, of course, but if Mr. Kabulov kindly agrees to also contribute, that would be absolutely great. Usually only a state based on democratic institutions and mechanisms as well as on transparency, basically the one founded on liberal democratic consensus, is considered enduringly strong. With the current Afghan reality, such an end state is nowhere in sight yet. With the Taliban takeover or even domination of the government, the situation is doomed to deteriorate as the Taliban have no penchant for transformation of institutional aid, only the economic assistance. Are the EU and other international actors mentioned today prepared to support such a state that contravenes all European values, first of all, women and minorities' rights as well as religious freedom? If for the sake of security, the answer is yes, wouldn't strengthen a pariah state like that just legitimize this untoward behavior and eventually undermine the very security agenda that was an initial raison d'etre of the entire endeavor? Thank you.
Many thanks. Well, I think from what has been said so far, it is clear that the real problem of today, after the withdrawal of the security and military foreign forces, is that the current government in Kabul is weak government, and the structure of the state is so different. There is so big varieties of ethnicities, of groups, points of view, and so on and so forth, that the difficulty to keep under control is what is, in my view, suggesting to broaden the cooperation to try to stabilize and to have a stronger government. Ambassador Kabulov suggested a government of grand coalition. I call it a compact for the future of Afghanistan, to pave the way for an inclusive system of governance. This is exactly to prevent what we don't want. And what we don't want is what you just say, a government which is dominated by those who denegate the basic values of our humanity. I wouldn't say about the values of our democracy or models or standards, but humanity. I think we can really and legitimately to make a distinction to the radical Talibans who never will give up killing other people, and those Talibans who will be ready to engage. I think Europe should be ready after the withdrawal of the foreign forces to engage in what Europe knows the best: institution building, help reconstruction. As I said before, heavily investing in education, because I don't like at all the tradition of madrasas, but just close by bombing madrasas. You have to educate the younger generations in order to offer an alternative, which is not only the submission of the women, although there are tendencies that are rooted in the Afghan society. So what I'm saying is now Europe, if united, if capable to cooperate with countries like Russia, China, Pakistan, and even with Iran, although the new president of Iran is for me some source of concern, only if Europe is ready to engage once again in its traditional soft power, we will have some possibility to be around the table. I'm not saying to solve the situation, to be around the table and to contribute by being donors, by sending experts, by training. My experience in training the women prosecutors in Herat province was exciting experience, because we are talking about young magistrates, all women, all trained on crimes against women. Would you like to save and to keep such an experience? Let's hope to exploit our European soft power. This is the only antidote to what is the preoccupation you express, which is also my preoccupation. I'm very sorry, but I have another institutional commitment. It has been a great pleasure, Ambassador Kabulov, dear Leonid, and dear all, to have been with us. Bye.
Спасибо большое.
Большое спасибо,
Yes,
господин.
thank you for your reply.
Bye-bye.
Есть ли у нас еще хотя бы 5 минут для вопросов? У нас порядка 5-6 еще
If we
остается.
have 5 or 6 more questions, specifically for Mr. Kabulov, perhaps we... Sure, but very quickly. Mr. Nazarov. Good morning, colleagues. I'm very glad and honored to be able to ask you a question. Personally, I've read many of your interviews and articles on Afghanistan. As a major expert, you know that the Taliban is a patchwork. In Doha, in Moscow, you can arrive at any kinds of conclusions, but there are some radically minded, wacky field commanders who don't care about any agreements. That's number one. Number two, according to the Sharia law, a word that you give to a non-believer, a non-follower of Islam, doesn't matter anything. And for the Taliban, their former allies are kafirs, not to mention Westerners. So they don't care about the people who are on the other shore of the Amu Darya River. So can we even be talking about any negotiations with the Taliban? Because the Talibs may say something to you and may agree to something in a conversation with you today, but they may be out of power tomorrow. And those who will replace them will not be committed to that word. So is it even reasonable to talk about negotiations? Thank you for your question. It shows that you have a lot of experience and common sense. But I don't agree with you on some of the issues. Number one, when we talk about negotiations and the words that is given, we're not just talking about negotiations with Russia. I understand the value of a commitment given to us, but I understand that there's more than just believing that this commitment will be met, that is necessary. You have to somehow follow through on it. You have to force them to stick to this commitment. A party that says yes to us may decide to renege on their promise, but they must understand that there's a price to pay. And Moscow uses all of its tools, all of its might, but all of its tact as well to show this. You are right when you say that the Taliban is a patchwork, but that's why I talked about roughly 2/3 of the Taliban who have a number of personal, ideological, and political reasons to believe that intra-Afghani talks will be more beneficial to them than hostilities. That's what I'm talking about, that there is this critical mass. There is the right sentiment, and this is very important. As I said many times before, of course, it's not going to be smooth sailing. We'll have many roadblocks. and pitfalls. You know, we're not kafirs as Russians. My father was an Uzbek. I was born into an Islam family. So who is kafir and who isn't? That's a big question for a later debate. But we are mindful of these concerns that you raised. We understand that real diplomacy is not based on emotion. It is based on interests and capabilities. Thank you. And Mr. Miras Srarov. Thank you, Mr. Kabulov. Thank you for your remarks. I had a few questions, but we don't have much time, so let me just ask one. Do you think that cooperation between Russia and Central Asian countries is only going to be focused on security issues, or Russia and Central Asian countries could create a major project for ensuring stability in Afghanistan? Well, first and foremost, our cooperation with our Central Asian partners does not stop at the security dimension. When we talk about Tajikistan or Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, or other countries, we have developed mutual economic interests, and this is a more important share of our bilateral and multilateral relations. As for joint work on Afghanistan, of course, it would be nice to pool our resources, to join our forces and work on Afghanistan. And this is not just because we feel so much love for Afghans, but because we have our own national interests. Lately, Uzbekistan, for example, has been thinking about a railway to Pakistan. That's a beautiful idea. It's a great project that requires a lot of support, but we have to be realistic about this. It can only be implemented when there's peace in Afghanistan. This project is very complicated, it's very costly. We may launch it, but we have to make sure that the resources are there, financial resources, the equipment, the technology, and so on. Both Russia and Central Asian states have a lot of internal domestic issues and problems. Currently, Russia's cooperation with these friendly nations is focused on helping, on fostering mutual growth and development. When we reach enough potential, of course, it will be important to help Afghanistan and include Afghanistan, engage with it, include it in the regional economic cooperation work, which is going to be a very important factor once the war in Afghanistan is over. Tens of thousands of people who have been profiteering from work will need to from war rather will need to find legitimate jobs, and this will be an important factor. And Natalia Fomenko, then Mr. Mamadov, and Fakiri Shahakmad. Ms. Fomenko, please. Good morning, Mr. Kabulov. Thank you for your insightful and very interesting remarks. In one of your interviews, you said that the so-called project where Afghanistan was considered to be a convenient strategic point for the United States to project influence on the Persian Gulf region and some other South Asian countries, and now this project is over. It's flat. Do you think that this project might be replaced by a similar project in this region or a different region in Asia? Number one, I have never heard of any important country that would want to have this job. If you're alluding to the People's Republic of China, I've never heard any statements from Chinese officials, at least in any public statements, that they would have some designs for Afghanistan. I do hear these comments, especially from the West, from Western media. But no, actually, I don't see this happening. I think that the US and NATO experience and lessons in Afghanistan actually has taught many other countries a good lesson, a lesson to countries that might be harboring these ideas otherwise. Thank you so much, Mr. Mamadov. Thank you, Mr. Kabulov. A very quick question, and simple one. Can the Taliban be a direct threat to Central Asian countries in the short term? In the short term, the Taliban is not going to be a threat to Central Asian countries if we talk about the movement. The movement in words and in actions has been careful to show that it's dealing with its internal domestic issues. Sure, it is fighting against the current government. It is seizing territory over swathes of land and districts, and is trying to control the provinces. Some of these districts and provinces are near the Afghan border with Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. However, the Talibs themselves, there's not one specific fact or incident of the Talibs actually trying to cross these borders or to threaten their northern neighbors. There's another question. For a long time, these territories have been home to some other international terrorist organizations, first and foremost ISIS or Daesh, but there are others, about 20 more smaller international terrorist organizations, just as militias. For tactical reasons, they cooperate, but I believe that ISIS is the leading player among them. These groups might try to exploit the chaos in the north of Afghanistan in order to undermine stability in the neighboring countries of Central Asia. But it just so happened that the Talibs have very bad relations with ISIS. The Taliban was waging an active war against the ISIS, which you can't say about the US and NATO or about the current Afghan government. Strange as it may seem, the presence of the Taliban on these territories is going to stem the growth of threats from ISIS and other international terrorist organizations to Central Asian countries. Thank you, Mr. Kabulov. And we have one final question from a representative of Afghanistan, Fakiri Shah Ahmad. You have the floor. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Good morning, Mr. Kabulov. Thank you for your great presentation. You mentioned mistakes committed by the Americans. The fact that the Americans gave the Taliban a political status. However, some recent developments have shown that the Talibs have not changed and have kept their ties to international terrorist organizations and groups, such as Al-Qaeda and others, which are present in this region. Recently, the Russian government has invited only the representatives of the Taliban to Moscow for negotiations. So what I'm interested is in the role of Russia in the context of the Afghan issue. The Russian Federation, as a reliable partner, could take some concrete steps to stabilize the region and find solutions to the Afghan settlement. What are these steps and measures? If you have been following this whole conversation today, I believe I've said enough on our role, including our initiatives. As for the ties between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and other organizations, only the Kabul government is talking about this, and the Americans. And sure, you would it would be nice to find a reason why the 300,000 Afghan army is yielding to 75,000 army of the Taliban. So this is blaming your own inability to protect your territory on something else. That's why you come up with all these theories. Fine. I have no facts, and I don't think that you have facts. You just repeat the talking points of the Afghan government. Okay, fine. Let's say that let's assume that this is true. We believe that Al-Qaeda is a small group now, less than 500 people. They have been inactive and are not a direct threat. They are not taking part in actual hostilities in Afghanistan. Americans don't understand. The Americans keep mentioning Al-Qaeda. 20 years ago, the Americans came to Afghanistan under the pretext of quashing Al-Qaeda. So this is a symbolic enemy for them. Al-Qaeda's name has to be loud and important, but it doesn't mean that the group is actually so strong anymore. So let's be realistic. I'm not a propagandist. I'm doing political diplomacy. I use facts that have proof. What you're saying is assumptions and guesses. These assumptions and guesses are created in order to explain your own failures and problems. Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Good luck to all. Thank you, Mr. Kabulov. Mr. Druchevsky, rather. Just a second.
Леонид Вадимович подключает звук.
As Mr. Druchevsky is turning on his microphone.
Вот. Далее.
Спасибо большое всем.
I would like to thank
Спасибо.
all of our participants today.
Хорошие вопросы.
Thank you for your smart and interesting question. And of course, the biggest thank you goes to Ambassador Kabulov for joining us today.
В основном аудиторию, которую
We had a lot of young people gathered here today, and these young people are interested in many issues, and they really care about the issue of Afghanistan.
Не только профессиональной жизни, но
not only in a professional sense.
Вообще, в принципе, так сказать.
They deeply care about what happens in Afghanistan. Anyway, thank you very much for your very smart comments, and thank you for your answers. It was very nice to talk to all of you. Let's stay in touch. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. I would also like to thank Andrea and all the rest of our participants. See you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.
До свидания.